Thinking too much is not intelligence, it is not depth, and it is not wisdom. It is hesitation caused by weak internal training, because a trained mind does not argue with itself endlessly. It acts, observes, and adjusts, while an untrained mind loops, doubts, and negotiates endlessly, mistaking mental noise for preparation. And this is where overthinking is born, not as a mental flaw, but as compensation. Because when a man lacks physical strength, emotional resilience, and behavioral discipline, the mind steps in to fill the gap, producing thoughts, scenarios, and endless internal dialogue to replace action. And the silent samurai understood this long before modern psychology, that clarity is not created by thinking harder, but by acting more. Because the mind is not designed to lead without structure, it is designed to follow training. And when there is no training, the mind panics, filling silence with noise, creating imaginary futures, rehearsing failures that have not happened, and negotiating with fear as if it were wisdom. And this is why overthinking exists, not because the mind is too active, but because the body and behavior are too passive. Because when action capacity is low, thought volume increases, and thinking becomes a substitute for movement, a way to feel busy without risking discomfort, a way to delay accountability while pretending to prepare. And the more capable you are of acting, the less your mind needs to talk, because action creates clarity, not thought. And this is why trained people think less, because soldiers, athletes, and warriors do not sit around analyzing every possible outcome. They rely on rehearsed responses, built through repetition. They trust muscle memory over imagination. Because training removes decision fatigue, repetition replaces doubt, and when a response has been practiced 1,000 times, the mind has nothing to argue about. It simply executes, while weak training creates mental noise, because without routines, every choice feels heavy. Without discipline, every action requires negotiation, and without structure, every step feels uncertain. So the mind fills the vacuum where discipline should exist, endlessly asking, what if, should I, and maybe later. Not because these questions are intelligent, but because there is nothing solid underneath them. And the psychological truth is simple. The mind hates uncertainty, and training removes uncertainty by narrowing options, by creating standards, by turning chaos into sequence. But modern life has stripped this away, because modern people overthink more than ever, not due to higher intelligence, but due to lack of hardship, lack of enforced routines, endless choices, and no initiation rites to harden the nervous system. Comfort has replaced challenge, and comfort breeds mental instability, because when nothing forces decisiveness, the mind is left alone with infinite possibilities and no consequences. And this is where anxiety thrives, where thought spirals multiply, and where hesitation becomes a lifestyle. While the samurai lived in contrast, discomfort trained silence. Comfort trains noise, because when your body is accustomed to cold, pain, repetition, and pressure, the mind has no reason to panic. It has seen worse, it has survived worse. But when your life is soft, unstructured, and consequence-free, every small decision feels like a threat, every action feels risky, and the mind reacts by overthinking. And this is why overthinking is not cured by thinking less, it is cured by training more. Because a silent samurai does not need to think excessively. His life is structured, his actions are rehearsed, his standards are non-negotiable, and his body obeys discipline, so the mind follows quietly. While the modern man drowns in thought because nothing in his life forces decisiveness, nothing demands commitment, and nothing punishes hesitation. And until training replaces comfort, the noise will never stop.
Strong training replaces thinking with execution, because thought expands in stillness and collapses in motion. And this is why action shrinks thought. Because when the body moves, attention grounds itself in reality. Mental loops lose oxygen, and imaginary fear dissolves under physical presence. Because anxiety cannot survive sustained movement. and a moving body leaves no room for imaginary fear, which is why strong training does not argue with thoughts, it starves them. And the silent samurai trained this deliberately through a triad that hardened the body, stabilized behavior, and exposed the mind to uncertainty, starting with physical training. Because physical training builds confidence through evidence, not affirmations. It teaches discomfort tolerance, not motivation, and it reduces fear response by proving repeatedly that the body can endure stress without collapse, while behavioral discipline removes chaos by fixing wake times, training windows, and standards regardless of mood, because consistency eliminates negotiation, and when standards are fixed, the mind stops asking for permission, and mental exposure completes the system by acting before clarity, facing discomfort repeatedly, and letting uncertainty exist without resistance. Because training makes uncertainty familiar, and familiarity removes fear. But overthinkers fear action precisely because action exposes reality, and reality removes excuses. Because thinking protects identity. It allows you to imagine competence without proving it, while action demands accountability. And this is why overthinking is identity protection, not intelligence, because it shields the ego from feedback, failure, and adjustment, while the silent samurai trains clarity by acting first, observing outcome, adjusting calmly, and repeating without emotion. No rumination, no drama, no self-judgment, because judgment wastes energy, and repetition builds mastery. And once this cycle is established, something irreversible happens. Thoughts lose authority, emotions stabilize, decisions accelerate, and calm becomes natural, because the nervous system adapts to action instead of anticipation, and thinking becomes a tool instead of a prison, something used deliberately, not something suffered constantly. And this is the shift that changes everything, because a silent samurai does not silence his thoughts by force, he silences them through preparation, discipline, and repeated action. Because overthinking only survives where hesitation is tolerated. And once your life is built on structure instead of mood, your mind stops negotiating and starts obeying. And that is the difference between intelligence and strength, between noise and clarity, and between a mind that talks endlessly and one that moves decisively.
Most people will hear everything you have heard so far and still return to overthinking, not because the ideas are wrong, but because escaping overthinking requires a level of honesty and training most people quietly avoid. Because the deeper truth is that overthinking is not merely a habit, it is a refuge, a psychological shelter built to protect a fragile sense of self. Because when a man has not forged competence through repeated effort, his mind becomes the last place where he can feel powerful, knowledgeable, and in control. And so thinking becomes identity, analysis becomes worth, and hesitation becomes safety. Because action carries risk, and risk threatens the story he tells himself about who he is, which is why so many people prefer endless thought over decisive movement. Because thought allows them to stay hypothetical forever, while action forces them into reality, where results are measurable, feedback is unavoidable, and excuses collapse instantly. And this is why weak training and overthinking persist together, because training would expose gaps, limits, and inadequacy, while thinking can endlessly rearrange narratives to avoid discomfort. And the silent samurai understood this instinctively, that the untrained mind clings to noise not because it enjoys it, but because silence would expose weakness. Because in silence there is no distraction, no justification, no illusion of progress, only the truth of what has been done and what has been avoided. And that truth terrifies the unprepared nervous system, so it fills the space with thoughts, worries, plans, and theories to avoid the stillness that would demand action. And this is why modern people consume endless content about discipline, but rarely become disciplined, because information feels like movement without risk, like progress without pain, and the brain rewards consumption the same way it rewards effort, even though nothing has changed. And over time, this trains the mind to substitute thinking for doing permanently, creating a loop where the person believes they are self-aware, reflective, and intelligent, when in reality they are simply untested. And this is why overthinking feels sophisticated to the untrained, because they confuse complexity with competence. But competence is simple. It shows up daily, repeats boring actions, and accepts discomfort without commentary, while complexity is loud, unstable, and endlessly self-referential. And the silent samurai rejects this entirely, because his life is not built on expression, but execution, not on preference, but principle, not on motivation, but obligation. And this is where the real separation begins, because escaping overthinking requires a shift from a mood-based life to a standards-based life. And this is where most people fail, because a standards-based life removes negotiation, and negotiation is where the ego hides. Because when your wake time, training time, work ethic, and effort level are fixed, there is nothing left to debate internally, and the mind loses its stage, its audience, and its power. Because the body moves whether the mind agrees or not. And over time, the mind learns to quiet itself, not through suppression, but through irrelevance, because it is no longer consulted on every decision. And this creates a level of calm that feels foreign to modern people, because they are accustomed to treating every emotion as a command and every thought as truth, when in reality, thoughts are often just nervous system noise produced by avoidance. And the silent samurai trains himself to see thoughts as weather, not orders, because training teaches you that discomfort does not mean danger, that uncertainty does not mean failure, and that fear does not mean stop. It simply means unfamiliar. And familiarity is built only through repetition, which is why most people never escape overthinking, because they attempt to think their way out of it, instead of training their way out of it. And thinking cannot solve a problem that is created by lack of exposure, because anxiety shrinks only when the body proves safety through action, not when the mind imagines safety through reassurance. And this is why modern psychology often fails the untrained, because it teaches people to analyze feelings without changing behavior, which increases self-focus without increasing resilience, turning people inward instead of outward, reflective instead of capable, articulate instead of grounded. And this is why people can describe their anxiety perfectly, but still be ruled by it, because insight without training is just narration, not transformation. And the silent samurai does not narrate his struggle, he trains through it, because he understands that confidence is not a belief, it is a byproduct of repeated survival under pressure. And this is why strong training changes identity at the nervous system level. Because when you consistently act despite discomfort, your brain rewires what it considers threatening. And over time, the same situations that once produced overthinking produce neutrality, then calm, then focus, because the nervous system has evidence, not arguments, and this evidence silences the mind more effectively than any mantra, because the mind trusts experience more than logic, which is why people who have never trained under stress overthink the smallest decisions, while those who have faced controlled hardship remain calm under pressure. And this is also why people who escape overthinking permanently do not do so gradually, but decisively, because at some point, negotiation must end and structure must begin, because half measures leave room for doubt, but non-negotiable routines eliminate it. And this is the moment where most people turn back, because structure feels restrictive to the untrained ego, but structure is freedom to the disciplined, because it removes the burden of choice, the fatigue of decision-making, and the anxiety of ambiguity, replacing it with sequence, rhythm, and inevitability. And inevitability is calming to the nervous system because it knows what comes next. And when the nervous system feels safe, the mind quiets naturally, without effort, without force, without suppression. And this is why the silent samurai does not seek peace directly. He seeks preparation, because peace is not a goal. It is a side effect of readiness, and readiness is built through physical strain, behavioral consistency, and repeated exposure to uncertainty, not through reflection alone. And this is the truth that makes most people uncomfortable, because it means there is no shortcut, no hack, no mental trick that replaces training. And this threatens the modern obsession with ease, optimization, and comfort, because true calm is earned, not discovered, and it cannot coexist with a lifestyle built on avoidance, indulgence, and endless choice. And this is why overthinking persists at scale in modern society, because society itself discourages hardship, structure, and discipline, selling freedom as the absence of constraint rather than the mastery of self. And the silent samurai stands apart precisely because he chooses constraint voluntarily, because voluntary hardship builds strength, and strength silences the mind. And once this shift occurs, life changes in subtle but profound ways, because decisions are made faster, not because of recklessness, but because clarity replaces doubt, because emotions pass without hijacking behavior, because action becomes default instead of debate, and the mind becomes an instrument instead of a tyrant, consulted when needed, ignored when not. And this is the final truth, that overthinking is not a flaw to be fixed, but a signal to be obeyed, a message that training is insufficient, structure is weak, and standards are negotiable. And the moment you respond to that signal with action instead of analysis, everything begins to realign. Because the silent samurai does not ask how to stop thinking. He asks how to train harder, live cleaner, and act sooner, knowing that silence will follow naturally, because a mind that trusts the body, the routine, and the process has nothing left to argue about. And in that silence, there is power, presence, and decisiveness that no amount of thinking could ever create.
If overthinking is the symptom and weak training is the cause, then the only permanent solution is a life built on non-negotiable structure. Because the silent samurai does not attempt to fix his mind directly. He designs his days so precisely that the mind has no opportunity to spiral. Because spirals only occur in unstructured time, uncommitted bodies, and undecided lives. And this is the core truth most people avoid. Because structure feels restrictive to those who live by impulse, but structure is liberation to those who seek calm. Because once your life is governed by standards instead of moods, your nervous system stabilizes, your thoughts lose authority, and your energy stops leaking into unnecessary decisions. And the silent samurai training code begins with a simple but brutal principle. Remove choice wherever possible, because choice is fuel for overthinking. And when every morning begins at a fixed time regardless of motivation, when training occurs whether enthusiasm is present or not, when effort is demanded even in low states, the mind learns something critical, that it is no longer in charge. And this immediately reduces internal negotiation, because negotiation only exists when obedience is optional. And most modern anxiety is not fear, it is unresolved negotiation between comfort and discipline. And once that negotiation ends, silence begins, because the body moves forward regardless of internal resistance, and the mind eventually follows because it has no leverage left. And the first pillar of this code is physical strain performed daily, not for aesthetics, not for validation, but to condition the nervous system to stress. Because a nervous system that experiences controlled hardship stops reacting catastrophically to imagined threats. And this is why strength training, endurance work, cold exposure, and breath control are not optional for the silent samurai, because they teach the body that discomfort does not equal danger,
that fatigue does not equal failure, and that pressure can be endured without collapse. And over time, this creates a baseline of calm that no affirmation could ever replicate, because the body now has evidence of resilience, and evidence silences doubt faster than logic. And the second pillar is behavioral rigidity, which modern culture misunderstands as rigidity of thought, when in reality it creates flexibility of mind. Because when wake time, training time, work blocks, and recovery windows are fixed, mental energy is preserved for execution instead of decision-making, and this eliminates decision fatigue, which is one of the primary drivers of overthinking, because a tired brain seeks certainty through analysis, but when decisions are pre-made through structure, the brain rests, and a rested brain is a quiet brain. And this is why the silent samurai repeats the same core routines daily, not because he lacks creativity, but because mastery is built through repetition, not novelty. And novelty is the enemy of calm, because it forces constant evaluation, comparison, and judgment, while repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds peace. And the third pillar is deliberate exposure to uncertainty, because overthinking thrives in avoidance, and avoidance trains fear, while exposure trains neutrality. And this means acting before clarity, starting before confidence, and moving before certainty, because certainty is not a prerequisite for action, it is a byproduct of action. And the silent samurai understands that waiting to feel ready is simply another form of hesitation disguised as prudence, because readiness is built in motion, not contemplation. And this is where most people fail permanently, because they demand emotional alignment before behavioral commitment, when in reality, behavior must lead emotion, not the other way around. And once this inversion is corrected, anxiety loses its grip, because emotions no longer dictate outcomes, they become background signals instead of commands. And this fundamentally alters identity, because the person no longer sees himself as someone who thinks about acting, but as someone who acts regardless of thought. And identity follows behavior relentlessly, which is why training is identity work, not motivation work. And once this identity shift occurs, overthinking loses its function, because it is no longer needed to protect the ego, justify inaction, or simulate progress, because progress is now tangible, visible, and embodied. And this is also why the silent samurai eliminates unnecessary stimulation, because constant input fragments attention, and fragmented attention breeds anxiety, while a reduced information diet restores presence, because presence is incompatible with rumination, and rumination requires distraction to survive. And when the mind is not constantly fed novelty, outrage, and comparison, it settles naturally, because it has fewer signals to process, fewer threats to evaluate, and fewer identities to compete with. And this creates internal alignment, where thought, action, and values move in the same direction, eliminating internal friction, which is the true source of mental exhaustion. And this alignment is reinforced through standards that are not negotiated daily, because daily renegotiation erodes discipline, while fixed standards build trust with the self. And self-trust is the ultimate antidote to overthinking, because when you trust that you will act regardless of discomfort, the mind stops panicking about outcomes, because it knows correction will follow execution. And this is why the silent samurai does not obsess over perfect decisions, because he trusts his ability to adjust, and adjustment is only possible through action, not contemplation. And this trust is built through repetition, through keeping promises to the body, through completing difficult tasks even when unseen, and through choosing effort when comfort is available, because each act of discipline deposits evidence into the nervous system that says, "I can be relied upon." And once this belief is internalized, anxiety collapses, because anxiety is fundamentally distrust in one's ability to handle future discomfort. And the silent samurai removes that distrust through daily proof. And this proof compounds silently, creating a calm presence that others misinterpret as confidence or detachment, when in reality it is preparedness. And this preparedness changes how the world is experienced, because challenges are approached instead of avoided, decisions are made instead of delayed, and silence replaces noise, because there is nothing left to debate internally. And this is the final transformation, where thinking becomes intentional rather than compulsive, used when planning is required, discarded when execution is needed. And this balance is what separates wisdom from rumination, because wisdom knows when to stop thinking and start moving. And the silent samurai lives permanently in this balance, not because he is special, but because he has trained himself to be ordinary in discipline, consistent in effort, and ruthless in eliminating negotiation. And this is the truth most people resist, because it means calm is not found through insight alone, but a lifestyle that demands effort daily, regardless of mood, energy, or inspiration. And yet, this is the only path that works permanently, because once your life is built on structure, strain, and exposure, the mind has no incentive to spiral, no need to invent fear, and no authority to delay action. And what remains is silence, presence, and decisive movement, not as a temporary state, but as a default way of being. And this is the silent samurai training code. Not a technique to stop thinking, but a way of life that makes overthinking impossible to sustain.
At a certain point, training stops being something you do and becomes something you are. And this is the point most people never reach, because reaching it requires letting go of the version of yourself that survives through hesitation, negotiation, and mental noise. And this is why the final stage of the silent samurai path is not more techniques, more routines, or more information, but an irreversible identity shift. Because overthinking does not fully die until it has no role left to play. And as long as your identity still benefits from hesitation, negotiation, and delay, the mind will keep producing them, not as a mistake, but as a strategy. Because the mind always serves the identity that feeds it. And this is the uncomfortable truth most people resist, that they secretly profit from overthinking, because it allows them to feel thoughtful without being tested, intelligent without being exposed, and cautious without being accountable. And until that profit is removed, overthinking will always return under stress, fatigue, or uncertainty. Which is why the silent samurai does not attempt to manage thoughts, but removes their usefulness entirely by building a life where action is inevitable, standards are fixed, and effort is assumed, because inevitability kills hesitation, and once action is inevitable, the mind adapts or becomes irrelevant. And this is the moment where the nervous system rewires permanently, because it no longer expects negotiation before movement. It no longer waits for emotional alignment before commitment, and it no longer treats uncertainty as a threat, but as a normal condition of life. And this normalization is what creates real calm, not the fragile calm that depends on reassurance, but the stable calm that persists under pressure, because it is built on competence, repetition, and survival. And this is why people who complete this shift appear different in subtle ways, because they move sooner, speak less, decide faster, and remain composed when others spiral. Not because they suppress emotion, but because emotion no longer dictates behavior, and behavior is the only thing that shapes reality. And this is where the final misunderstanding must be destroyed, that calm comes from control, because calm does not come from controlling outcomes, it comes from trusting your ability to respond to any outcome. And that trust is earned only through repeated exposure to discomfort without retreat, which is why the silent samurai seeks difficulty voluntarily, because voluntary hardship builds a nervous system that does not panic when life becomes involuntary hard. And this is the difference between modern comfort-seeking and warrior preparation,
because comfort-seeking creates fragility masked as sensitivity, while preparation creates strength expressed as restraint. And restraint is the highest form of power, because it is power that does not need to announce itself. And as this identity solidifies, something unexpected happens. The internal dialogue that once dominated your days begins to fade, not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, because it is no longer rewarded, no longer consulted, and no longer needed. And silence becomes your default state, not an achievement you chase, but the background of your life. And in this silence, thinking still exists, but it is sparse, deliberate, and useful, because it is used only when required, then released, not clung to, not repeated, not inflated into self-importance. And this is the mark of true mental strength, not the absence of thought, but mastery over when thought appears and when it disappears. And this mastery cannot be learned intellectually. It must be trained into the nervous system through daily action, because the body learns faster than the mind, and the body never lies about what it can endure. And this is why the silent samurai path always returns to the body, to movement, to strain, to repetition, because the body is the anchor that keeps the mind from floating into abstraction, and abstraction is where anxiety breeds. And once this anchor is set, life simplifies, not because it becomes easy, but because it becomes clear. Because clarity is not knowing every answer, but knowing what to do next without debate. And this is why the final stage of this path feels anticlimactic to those addicted to drama, because there is no grand emotional release, no sudden enlightenment, no permanent bliss, only quiet consistency, daily effort, and steady execution. And yet this is precisely what makes it powerful, because it is sustainable. And sustainability is the real measure of strength, not intensity. And this is where the conclusion must be drawn clearly, that overthinking is not an enemy to be fought, but a signal to be respected, because it tells you exactly where your life lacks structure, where your training is insufficient, and where your standards are negotiable. And once you respond to that signal correctly, with action instead of analysis, with structure instead of reassurance, and with effort instead of explanation, the signal stops because it has been answered. And this is why the silent samurai does not obsess over stopping thoughts, because thoughts are not the problem, avoidance is. And once avoidance is removed, thoughts lose their grip naturally. And this brings us to the final truth that closes the entire series, that intelligence is not thinking more, wisdom is knowing when thinking is unnecessary, and strength is acting without waiting for permission from the mind. And the silent samurai embodies this completely, because his life is not built around feeling ready, but around being prepared, and preparation is visible only in action, not intention. And this is why his presence feels grounded, his decisions feel final, and his mind feels quiet, because everything inside him is aligned towards execution, not negotiation. And if there is one conclusion that must remain after this final part, it is this, that calm is not found by escaping discomfort, but by becoming capable inside it. And once you become capable, silence follows naturally, not as a reward, but as a consequence. And this is the point of no return, where overthinking no longer defines you, not because you defeated it, but because you outgrew it. And the silent samurai does not celebrate this moment, does not announce it, and does not explain it. He simply continues training, continues acting, and continues living quietly. Because silence is not something he seeks anymore. It is simply who he has become.